A tourist spat in the face of a royal guard, thinking he could get away with anything. But one step from the guard and a silent rebuke from a veteran changed everything. Here's how it happened. A foggy morning enveloped Buckingham Palace, adding an air of grandeur and mystery. As on any other day, tourists gathered near the iconic gates. Some admired the architecture with awe, while others clicked away on their cameras, hoping to capture a piece of British history. At the center of all this attention stood James Harper, a royal guard, motionless as a statue. James was the embodiment of discipline and honor. At 28 years old, he was the picture of military perfection, tall, with a commanding presence and a fixed, unyielding gaze. His impeccably pressed uniform gleamed under the morning sun, and his bearskin hat added to his imposing stature. He knew today would be like any other. A few attempts to make him laugh, a couple of silly questions from tourists. It was all part of the job. But amidst the usual chaos of the crowd, one group of tourists stood out. Young and loud, they weren't there to admire history. With oversized cameras in hand, their voices drowned out even the hum of traffic on the mall. Leading the group was a man in his early 30s, average height, a smug grin on his face, and a coffee cup in his hand. He moved confidently toward the guard. "Hey, mate, why so serious?" he called out loudly, stopping right in front of James. His voice cut through the air, clearly meant to draw attention. James, of course, did not respond. It was against the rules. He continued to stare straight ahead, as if the man didn't exist. "Whoa, guys, look at him! He doesn't even blink! Maybe he's a robot!" The tourist laughed, and his friends joined in. The crowd started murmuring, and some took out their phones to record the funny guy teasing the guard. "Come on, crack a smile! You're on duty, aren't you?" someone from his group shouted. James stood like a stone, but inside, he could feel his patience tightening like a stretched wire. This was part of his duty, to endure taunts, provocations, and foolish antics that some tourists found entertaining. But this particular tourist seemed determined to push the limits. Taking a small sip from his cup, he suddenly spat the coffee in James's direction. The crowd gasped. A moment of silence cut through the air as everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The group of tourists burst into laughter, their leader clearly thinking he had won. This was the performance he had come to London for. "Seriously? Spitting in the face of the royal guard?" someone in the crowd whispered, their words hanging in the air like a sharp rebuke. James didn't move. His face remained as still as it had been moments ago, but the tension in his posture became evident. The crowd, captivated, watched his every move. The tourist, meanwhile, was clearly pleased with himself. Crossing his arms, he turned to his friends. "See? No reaction. They're just here for us, like mannequins." But mannequins couldn't command respect through sheer presence. Little did he realize that to most of the crowd, he already looked less like a hero and more like a pitiful fool, his laughter echoing in a sea of disapproval. "That's too far. How could anyone think this is okay?" someone muttered from the sidelines. Indeed, how? James stood there, not just a soldier, but a guardian of tradition and honor. And this tourist? He was just a visitor, thinking his money entitled him to disrespect everything he saw. The crowd around Buckingham Palace buzzed with energy. The tourists' brazen provocation had split the onlookers into two camps. Some tried to brush it off. "He's just joking, relax." But others, mostly from the older generation, were visibly outraged. "This is disgraceful," an elderly woman in an elegant coat muttered, leaning on her cane. Raising her voice to cut through the noise, she called out, "Young man, have you no respect at all?" The tourist smirked and took another sip of coffee. "Oh, come on, Grandma. I'm just having fun. If you're so upset about this guy, why don't you take his place?" He was that kind of person, the kind who thought the world revolved around him because he'd bought a plane ticket and booked a London tour. To him, the guard was nothing more than part of the attraction, a living exhibit he felt entitled to provoke. James Harper stood as still as ever. His posture was perfect, his gaze focused. But even he, trained to endure provocation, could feel the tension rising. A faint pulse beat in his temples. Emboldened by his own antics, the tourist stepped forward, crossing the white line, the invisible barrier separating the guard from the public. This wasn't just a line on the ground. It was a symbol, a clear boundary. Do not cross. "And what happens if I do this?" he asked, reaching out as if to touch James's bearskin hat. That was the last straw. With a sharp, practiced motion, James raised his rifle, intercepting the tourist's hand mid-air. "Step back, sir!" James's voice rang out, loud and firm, like a crack of thunder. The crowd froze. Even those who had been laughing moments earlier fell silent. The resolve in James's voice and the tension in his stance were impossible to ignore. He stared at the tourist with a calm intensity, studying him as if deciding whether he even deserved a warning. The tourist flinched, but quickly tried to recover. He couldn't show weakness in front of his friends. Jerking his hand back, he turned to the crowd, looking for support. "Oh, wow, look at him! So serious!" he sneered, his voice quieter, but still defiant. His friends tried to egg him on. "Come on, show him who's boss. What's he gonna do?" One of the group theatrically pulled a few coins from his pocket and tossed them at James's feet. "Here's a tip for you, mate," he said with a mocking grin. James didn't flinch. His face remained impassive, but the tight grip on his rifle revealed the strain of his restraint. Even as the coins clinked against the stones, he didn't move. "This isn't funny! It's disgusting!" Someone in the crowd finally shouted. The tide was turning. The onlookers murmured in agreement, nodding as whispers of disapproval spread. The group of rowdy tourists, however, seemed oblivious. They lived in their own world, one where being on vacation excused any behavior. "All right, guys, let's see what else our buddy here can do." The leader laughed, clearly intent on dragging the spectacle out further. But then James made the slightest movement. He turned his head just a fraction, his piercing gaze locking onto the instigator. It wasn't just a glance. It was a silent rebuke so powerful it seemed to freeze time. For the crowd, there was no doubt anymore. The Royal Guard was a symbol of dignity and tradition, something these tourists were far beneath. The conflict wasn't over, but the tension was electric, the crowd waiting for what would happen next. The crowd grew louder, buzzing with fascination at this absurd show. Some laughed, others expressed open outrage, while many simply filmed the scene, knowing it would soon flood social media under dramatic headlines. From the center of the crowd, cutting through the sea of people, an elderly man emerged. His steps were slow, his cane nearly slipping on the cobblestones, but his gaze radiated more strength than the entire group of tourists combined. A veteran, this was immediately clear. It wasn't just the old military jacket he wore with pride, but also his posture, exuding dignity despite his age. "What kind of circus is this?" he called out, his voice loud and firm, addressing the tourists. The crowd fell silent. Even those who had been snickering moments before now stood quietly, watching the old man. "Do you have any idea who these people are? They're not here for your amusement." His voice carried the weight of more than just the guard. It seemed to speak for everyone who had ever served and defended this country. But the star of this mockery, the brazen tourist, only smirked. "Relax, old man. You're probably one of them too. Lighten up. It's just a show," the tourist said lazily, taking another sip of his coffee. If the veteran's gaze could cut, the man would have drowned in his own coffee. Slowly, with a slightly trembling hand, the veteran adjusted his medals, as if reminding himself to speak, not shout. He turned to the crowd and declared, "This man represents the honor and traditions of our country, and you're acting like cheap clowns." The crowd stirred. Some nodded approvingly, others fell silent, while a few continued watching through the screens of their phones. But the cocky tourist wasn't ready to back down. Smirking again, he suddenly spat coffee in the guard's direction. And that was when everything changed. James, who had stood still as a statue up until now, stepped forward decisively. His movements were swift and precise, like a military maneuver honed to perfection. He positioned himself in front of the veteran, shielding him from the tourist, and spoke loudly, but with restraint. "You've crossed the line. Return to your area immediately." His voice was so commanding and authoritative that even the brazen tourist faltered for a moment. Instinctively, he stepped back, as if he had just realized he wasn't dealing with an ordinary man in a uniform, but someone whose mere presence demanded respect. The crowd came alive. Someone began clapping, as though recognizing that this was a moment worth honoring. "Good for him!" shouted the elderly woman who had earlier tried to shame the tourist. Her voice was echoed by others in the crowd. "Now that's a real man," someone called out. As for the tourist, he stood there, glancing between James and the veteran, clearly unsure how to recover from the situation. His friends, who moments ago had cheered him on with cries of, "Show them who's boss," had gone quiet, some even retreating slowly into the crowd. All attention was now on James and the veteran. The veteran looked at James with gratitude in his eyes and softly said, "Good job, son." It wasn't just a simple thank you. It was an acknowledgement that dignity and tradition could still rise above cheap entertainment. James nodded silently, holding his position, but the respect in his eyes was unmistakable. The crowd, once divided, now burst into applause and cheers of support. This was no longer a spectacle for tourists. It had become a story of resilience and respect, one that none of them would soon forget. The tourist began to realize things weren't going his way. The crowd was no longer laughing. His friends, who had cheered him on moments ago, were now averting their eyes, some even looking embarrassed. It seemed they were ashamed of themselves for encouraging him earlier. The man tried to ease the tension. "Hey, come on, everyone. It was just a joke. Lighten up. Why so serious?" he said, glancing around, hoping for some supportive smiles. Instead, he was met with disapproving glares. "Oh, now it's just a joke, when everything's falling apart, right?" the silence around him seemed to say. Then someone from the crowd shouted, "Who does that? This is a disgrace!" Another woman chimed in loudly. "You think this is funny? You look like a complete idiot." The man shifted uncomfortably, his feet shuffling as if the ground beneath him had turned hot. But it was too late. One of the onlookers who had filmed the entire scene had already uploaded the video online. Social media was exploding with footage of the tourist, spitting on the guard and receiving a firm but dignified response. The crowd, which had been divided moments ago, now united in its disapproval of the tourist. Someone clapped, and then another, until applause rippled through the square. A police officer, drawn by the commotion, approached the scene. The tall man in a navy uniform addressed the tourist in a calm but firm voice. "You've violated public decorum. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the area." "Oh, come on. We were just having fun," the tourist protested weakly, but his voice had lost its bravado. "Immediately, sir," the officer repeated, stepping forward. The tourist had no choice but to comply. His group tried to act as if they didn't know him, shuffling awkwardly behind him as he left. He tried to salvage a shred of pride, calling over his shoulder, "Relax, people. It was just entertainment." But his words were drowned out by the murmurs of disapproval from the crowd. As the tourist disappeared around the corner, one woman stepped forward. She bent down to pick up the coins the man had thrown earlier and held them in her hand. Looking at the crowd, she declared, "This man deserves more than your cheap spectacle." Her words sparked another wave of applause, louder this time. The crowd wasn't just supporting her. They were honoring James Harper, who had stood steadfast through it all. James adjusted his bearskin hat with calm precision, as if nothing had happened, and returned to his post. His composure and restraint commanded respect, felt in every gaze directed toward him. The elderly veteran stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. Looking James directly in the eyes, he quietly said, "Thank you for your service, son." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that couldn't be expressed with applause or cheers. It was recognition from someone who understood the value of honor and resilience. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the emotions in the air lingered. Somewhere, phones buzzed with notifications, comments on the viral video pouring in. The footage now told a story not of mockery, but of dignity triumphing over ignorance. As the square emptied, James remained at his post, just as he had that morning when it all began. He stood motionless, like a statue, his image a lasting symbol of honor and dedication. The day ended for James as it had begun, in silence, broken only by the faint hum of London's streets. But he knew his work mattered. His unshakable stance had proven that honor and respect could still prevail over arrogance and ignorance.